If you have just joined us and missed the first panel, I'm Kevin Roberts, the Executive Vice President of the Foundation. On behalf of all of us, including our President, Brooke Rollins, our board, we are grateful for your presence. We're always privileged to have guests here at the Foundation's building in Austin, and we're particularly privileged today to have one of our friends, one of the stalwarts for right-minded conservative thinking with us. Attorney General Ken Paxton is the 51st Attorney General of Texas, having been elected in November of 2014. During his tenure, General Paxton has won major cases for Texas on immigration, school rights, EPA rules, and religious freedom. Fighting federal overreach, our topic today, he's filed 22 lawsuits against the Obama administration during a 2-year stretch, of which 5 were heard in the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2016, he secured a final settlement of $50 million in the state's lawsuit against VW over its emissions cheating scandal. He's been aggressive in approach to protecting the health and safety of Texans from illegal synthetic drugs. Most of all, he's a proud father, husband, a great American, and a great Texan. And I'm privileged on behalf of all of us here to introduce General Ken Paxton.
Hey, thank you all. Good to be here. Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas. This is obviously a topic that I care a lot about. How many of y'all have heard me speak in the last 6 months? Raise your hand if you have. Oh, that's going to be fun. I'll have to change my topic right here. You know, a lot of people have been worried about me because, you know, Obama's not in office anymore, so they've kind of wondered, since I sued the administration 22 times, and we've actually sued the Trump administration 5 times over policies that were left over. So it was actually 27 times. Thank you. I appreciate the applause. 27 times over 27 months. So it was about once a month that we sued the federal government. So it did not stop just because Trump came into office. As a matter of fact, one of them was a suit against the Department of Energy. Anybody know who's the head of the Department of Energy? So it was kind of funny because I got a call from the Department of Energy secretary. Yeah, you probably heard of Rich Perry. And he said, hey, I hear you might be suing us. Is there any way we can head that off? Da, da, da. I said, yeah, if you can write a check for about $1.5 billion in the next couple of weeks, I won't sue you. So weeks went by and we ended up suing the Department of Energy. I don't think that he exactly liked the title, which was Texas v. Perry. So we put that a little further down. Well, my wife is actually in town today, Angela, who is running for the state Senate. She's got other meetings. I wish she were here because her song, she introduces me a lot with this song, which is not as up to date as it used to be, but the title of the song is, and she wrote it, the title of the song is, I'm a pistol packing mama and my husband sues Obama. And every line, every stanza rhymes with Obama, so it's pretty cute. I wish she could be here to sing. The only downside for me is she usually gets a standing ovation and I just get claps. So anyway, I do think that when we had Governor Abbott in office, there were 31 lawsuits. And I think you remember him saying that I get up in the morning, go to the office, I sue the federal government, I go home. 31 lawsuits in 6 years, and then we added 27 more, which is a lot of lawsuits against the federal government. And I want to talk about a few of those lawsuits, not to bore you with the details, but I want to talk about those to show you, one, how different those lawsuits are, and two, then how similar they are and why they should matter to you and why they should matter to the people in this room, why they should matter to Texans and really to all Americans. So many of our lawsuits were against the EPA. We had 12 lawsuits against the EPA. The biggest one was the Clean Power Plan, and that was an effort by the federal government to take over electricity generation regulation, which had typically been in the realm of the states. The cost to the taxpayers of this country, consumers, was going to be about $29 to $39 billion a year. It's a really big cost. As far as we could tell, it was going to create a problem with the generation of electricity, so reliability was going to go down, and there was no benefit to the air. So we sued. And we sued along with West Virginia. Of course, West Virginia, at the time, Texas was about 40% coal generated. That's what was designed to shut down all coal plants. West Virginia was about 96 to 98%. I don't really know what would have happened to West Virginia had this continued, but they would have been in real trouble. So we led the way. We had 24 states. We were fortunate. We took it to the D.C. Court of Appeals, which had just been stacked by a bunch of Obama judges, by Harry Reid, and we lost. And so we appealed to the Supreme Court, and what we were trying to get done is we wanted to stay while we proceeded with our litigation, because the strategy of the Obama administration had been really simple, and the EPA would basically force us into litigation for years. We might win in the end, but during that period we'd have to comply. And so we were trying to get the courts to say, hey, you need to hold this up so that we can proceed with our litigation and show that we shouldn't have to comply. So this was the first time we actually got it stopped. We actually got a 5-4 decision. It was Scalia's last week of life, and he gave us a 5-4 victory, which allowed us to proceed with our litigation without actually having to spend the 29 to 39 billion or having that cost go to the consumers. And so we were successful in getting it stopped, which was a huge victory for us. And then ultimately when Trump came into office, we made the argument to them, to the EPA, and we made the argument to the new EPA administrator. His name is Scott Pruitt, former Oklahoma Attorney General. And the great thing about Scott is he used to be in my lawsuits against the federal government and the EPA, and now he's running the EPA. So it was kind of nice to have his insight into understanding the problems of the states, and ultimately they blocked it and rescinded the Clean Power Plan, and so we're not dealing with that. It was a huge victory for Texas, really a huge victory for all states, even states that seemingly wanted this to happen. I also want to tell you about, this is a very, very different type of litigation. This was involved, if you'll remember, the bathroom guidelines. Very different from what happened here in Texas in the legislature. The bathroom guidelines were an edict from the Department of Education, and they were basically directing administrators to change their policy as it relates to boys and girls in showers, locker rooms, hotel rooms. If they didn't comply, they were going to lose their federal funding, and they were also told, don't listen to community leaders. This was in the guidelines. Don't listen to your community leaders, don't listen to teachers, don't listen to parents, just follow what we're telling you to do. Again, this wasn't in the statute. They were literally changing the words in the statute that Congress had put together in the 70s and 60s. And so we sued with 13 other states, and then we also helped Nebraska file in another circuit. So we had 10 more states. So we had 23 states, if you count North Carolina, 24 states, again, a huge number of states involved in fighting back. And ultimately, we filed our litigation up in Wichita Falls. And part of the reason I like Wichita Falls for the Department of Justice is we filed in the summer. And the summer, I don't know if you know this, but Wichita Falls is about 10 degrees hotter than the rest of Texas in the summer. There's a high pressure that sits over. And it's also really hard to get to from DC. So I thought that would be a great place to file, given that the Department of Justice have to fly there in the summer and find a place to stay and live in Wichita Falls during the summer. So that's why we filed in Wichita Falls. And apparently worked. We actually got an injunction, preliminary injunction, to stop it from going into effect. And as soon as President Trump came into office, he rescinded that as well. Probably our most known litigation was one that Governor Abbott, at the time Attorney General Abbott, filed literally, I think it was 3 weeks before he was sworn in as governor. And I always love to give him a hard time saying, you took all the credit filing and left me all the work. So we literally, my second week of office, we had 26 states, which he built an amazing coalition. 26 states, obviously remarkable that it was more than a majority of states. I guess under the calculation of 57 states it wouldn't have been, but under the normal calculation, it was a majority of states, which is remarkable. I don't know that that had ever happened before in the history of the country. And I'll get back to that point in a minute. So this was litigation that involved the president changing immigration law that affected about 4 million, we guess about 4 to 5 million illegals in this country, giving them legal status to work, giving them certain benefits under federal and state law. And there was no vote by Congress. For 6 years, the president had told us he didn't have the authority to change the law. He said, I'm not an emperor, I'm not a king. Congress has to do this. He said this over and over and over. And then in November of 2014, literally right before I came into office, he said, I am just changed the law. And so we filed this lawsuit. We went to the Southern District of Texas. I think it was my second or third week of office. And we asked for an injunction, a preliminary injunction. And for those of you who know, are lawyers, you know that a preliminary injunction is not that easy to get. You have to show that the state would suffer irreparable harm and that they were likely to win on the merits if they actually went to trial. So we were successful in that. The Obama administration challenged us, took us to the Fifth Circuit. We argued our case there, and we were successful again. And then ultimately, we ended up in the Supreme Court. The Obama administration took the Supreme Court. Kind of fun for me. I sat right across from Attorney General Loretta Lynch. She wasn't very friendly that day. And unfortunately, Scalia had passed away. So, we knew we'd probably lost a vote. And ultimately, we got a 4-4 tie. And that meant that the Fifth Circuit position stayed. And so we were successful in blocking one of Obama's, if not his most important sort of legislative action. We were successful in blocking it so that we could go back and try it on the merits. But we'd already been told by the judge we were likely to win. So I want to come back to that case. It's very important, but I want to do something a little different today. We also had this issue with DACA, which was a follow-up to DAPA. The first immigration case dealt with parents of illegals. The second one that we hadn't filed a lawsuit dealt with the children, who are now not children. And we knew that that was also unconstitutional, although it was more politically sensitive because it was dealing with children. But we always felt like it really mattered that it was done the right way. If that's the right policy, then it needs to be done by Congress, not by a president who's issuing edicts from on high. And so we sent a letter to President Trump with 9 other attorney generals, and we said, look, we'll give you till September 5th because the judge basically had asked us to dismiss our lawsuit because he basically won on DAPA. And he asked us, if you want to amend this, you have till September to do so. So we gave the administration a couple months to make a decision, either rescind this or we are going to sue you. And we felt very comfortable that if we sued, we were going to win because it was the same argument we'd made in DAPA. Well, sure enough, on that day, on September 5th, Jeff Sessions came out and said, we're going to rescind this in 6 months. We're going to give 6 months time to basically resolve this, give Congress time to pass it, which is the way it should be done. And that's where we were successful in basically undoing DAPA. And we're still in that period. March 5th is the last day. But I want to introduce my daughter, and I want her to come up because she actually had a little DACA debate. And this is Madison Paxton. She is a junior at Texas A&M. I figured there had to be at least one. And she wasn't all that excited that I was calling her up. I didn't really give her a choice because she's here today with me. She's done with classes. And she actually is going to tell you a story about her DACA story. So Madison, if you would tell them what happened to you at Texas A&M and your DACA story, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, so I'm in an ESL class. I'm an education major, and my teacher emailed us and she said that we were going to have a debate about DACA. And so I did a little bit of research and I realized that my dad would probably know something about it. So I called my dad and I asked him some stuff about it. So I was pretty informed and I knew kind of what the two sides would be. And so I went into the class and I kind of let some people talk first just to see if I would really have anybody to debate or if they would all kind of know what was going on. But nobody really seemed to be aware of the constitutional issue. They didn't seem to understand why Trump did what he did. So I brought that up, and I also brought up that they weren't kids anymore, because that was one of the big points that everybody was bringing up, that Trump was trying to deport a bunch of children. And which I brought up is these people were 15 in 2007, so none of them are kids anymore. And also, we really don't have the resources to just deport all of these people. So I brought that up, and then I brought up the constitutional fact that the reason Trump did what he did was because it doesn't go with the Constitution. In order to have a law, you need to go through the correct channels to do that. And so I said, he gave Congress 6 months to do something about this. So if you guys feel like you want this, then y'all should call your congressman. So after that, nobody really had much else to say about it. Yeah, and then at the end of class, my teacher, she was like, where are you getting this information from? Like, what sources did you use? And I said, well, I talked to the Attorney General. And she was like, what? How did you do that? And I said, well, he's my dad, so I called him. Yeah, so.
Thank you, Madison. That's just to encourage you that you too can defend the Constitution. I've tried to train my children well. She did really well, and I'm proud of her for speaking up, because you said there was one other person in the class that defended what the president did, and she was the only other person. So anyway, way to go, Madison. So my point about these cases, while they're all very different, they're really all similar in really one way. And this was a president that after 2 years, he lost Congress, and he decided instead of working and negotiating like you're supposed to do under the Constitution, he decided that he was going to start making his own law through agencies, through executive orders, through guidelines, and this was all supposed to be followed, or you lose funding, or you lose something. There's always a penalty to it. And so effectively he was creating law at the executive level, and that was his strategy. And all of these cases were just like that. And we all know that the founding of this country, that our founders really cared about separation of powers. They didn't want a king. They'd already been through that. They wanted to divide power because they did not trust power in the hands of too few people. And so they created this structure that has lasted until now, and yet we were on the brink of losing it as Congress, in my opinion, sat on the sidelines. They didn't do anything about it. I went to the U.S. Senate. I had a lunch with about 50 U.S. senators. I said, hey, why don't you guys defund this? I mean, that is an effective way. I don't have to win the case if I feel like I will win the case because we're right in the Constitution, but I could end up with a bad panel at the Fifth Circuit that has a different view. You guys can just defund it. That will take care of it. They never did it. They never defunded any of Obama's made-up law. And then on the other side, we had the courts who were giving deference through the Chevron doctrine, where they give deference to agency action that's based on statute that relates to issues that the agency is over. And then there's another doctrine called the Auer doctrine, where the courts were giving deference to the agency's own rules. So if you had a fight with the agency, you pretty much lost in court. And so then we had our courts not doing their job. And so separation of powers was slowly dissipating, not slowly, quickly dissipating. And then the states were stuck in this position where federalism, which we all know that the founding of our country, the founders really did care about states' rights and retaining powers that weren't specifically granted in the Constitution to the federal government, that those be retained, and we were losing those. And so here we were, for the first time in, I think, U.S. history, where the states were stepping in and saying, okay, if Congress won't stop this, if the courts won't stop this, we're going to step up. And we had many, many cases where we had many, many states involved, sometimes, as I said, more than a majority. And I don't think that's ever happened in the history of the country. And I'm pretty convinced that had Texas not led the way, because we had the resources, we had the talent, we had the ability to go toe-to-toe with the DOJ, Department of Justice, and win on a consistent basis over and over and over. We were successful in court. Not 100%, but we were winning more than we were losing. And we were having an impact on stopping this change in the structure of our federal government. So the question is, now that we have a different president, that isn't really happening. Are we done with this whole issue? And I think we wouldn't be here if we were done with this whole issue. The battle really has just changed to a different battleground. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that because that's where I'm focused now. So I don't want you guys to think I've run out of things to do because we really do have a real battle on our hands. And I want to give you a federal example, and then I'm going to give you a couple of state examples. The federal example was a travel ban. Travel ban was issued by the president. It's the 45th, I think, issued since Jimmy Carter. The first 44 went by unnoticed. For some reason, when Trump issued it, it became an issue. And our Democratic AGs from Washington State, and I think there were 15 total, adopted our strategy, play out of our playbook, and they filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration, and guess where they filed it? The Ninth Circuit. We all know why they filed in the Ninth Circuit, the most liberal circuit in the country, overturned probably, I think, more than any other circuit in the country. They filed in Washington State, and the argument was that these non-resident aliens being people that aren't from here, that don't live here, haven't been to the country, have a constitutional right to due process. They have a right to a hearing, and then there were other arguments made that they have a First Amendment right not to be discriminated against because they're Muslim. And so the Washington District Court found a constitutional right. When it got to the Ninth Circuit, Texas on its own filed an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, to explain to the court, hey, there are no constitutional rights for people that don't live here, but there is a statute directly on point, and you should pay attention to what the law says, what Congress passed and gave the authority to the president that basically said this: the president, any president, has the authority to restrict entry of any class of aliens that he views as detrimental to the country. So could there be a statute more on point? I don't think so. It directly related to the issue, and yet the Washington District Court and ultimately the Hawaii District Court and the Ninth Circuit disregarded the law. They didn't pay attention to it. They instead addressed constitutional issues. By the way, we're still on appeal. We're now at the U.S. Supreme Court. We have 16 states involved. And I remember my first interview on the travel ban, Sunday night, I went on MSNBC, and the reason I went on is because I knew none of you would be watching. And I remember I was sitting in the studio in Dallas. It was dark. You're just looking into a camera. You got an earbud, and the commentator had a little clip from the Washington AG, and he was talking about how Texas is crazy and how we're all alone. Nobody else cares about this. You know, they're just totally out on a limb by themselves. And so the commentator, who's a lawyer, came back and he said, how about that, you know, AG Paxton? What do you say about, you know, don't you feel lonely being, you know, the only one filing this amicus brief? And I said, well, actually, I'm from Texas. I'm from a state of 28 million people, and so I'm never lonely. So we've moved on to be successful. But that's an example of federal law, and that they've done the same thing with Sanctuary City. But that's also happening in our state. So now, when the legislature, the people that you put into power to make decisions for you, your duly elected members of the House and Senate, when they debate things and they pass something, the governor signs it, the new strategy is if the left doesn't like it, they file a lawsuit. And so, you know, I have numerous examples of lawsuits now that I'm fighting. I'm going to tell you about just a couple of them. One of them is Sanctuary City that was just passed this session. And the first thing that I noticed that they do on this is they change the narrative. The narrative is it's a show me your papers bill, and that victims and witnesses will be afraid to come in and testify. Well, let me tell you about the bill. It is not a show me your papers bill. It has nothing to do with that. And there's a specific protection for victims and witnesses in the bill that basically says you can't ask the immigration status. If you are a victim or a witness, you can't be asked. What the bill actually does, and by the way, I don't pass these bills, I defend them. The bill is very simple. It basically says that law enforcement can ask about immigration status. It doesn't require it, just as they can too. It requires that sheriffs and other law enforcement, if they have a illegal who's committed a crime or suspected of committing a crime, they have to turn that person, when they're released, over to the federal government. Now, I don't know how you defend not doing that if you're a city. Now, the city of Austin is part of the lawsuit. So is San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, El Paso. They're spending lots of your money to do what that benefits us. I'm trying to figure out what the benefit is to any citizen to protect illegals who have committed crimes and keep them in this country. I don't see an upside. They don't ever talk about that. They don't ever defend it. They don't ever actually defend the bill or talk about the bill. They talk about other issues. And so they sued us in the court of their choice. So we typically lose in a district court. We lost. We appealed to the Fifth Circuit, and we actually appealed to get the law just put back in effect first before we actually argued the merits. And we went in front of a fairly liberal panel. It was Obama judge, Clinton judge, and a Bush judge. And I thought we were going to lose 2-1, 3-0. And remarkably, we had a 3-0 victory. And then we had the opportunity to actually go back and argue the merits. I'm very confident in the end we'll be successful. But again, this is the strategy. Go to a liberal judge, one judge, not elected, have them change the law. And I want to give you 2 more examples. Voter ID, passed in 2011, very simple legislation, requires that you show a photo ID to vote. It has been claimed that it's discriminatory. It was struck down before I came into office. We appealed it. The Fifth Circuit said you need to make a change. So we made the change this last legislative session requiring that if somebody shows up without a photo ID and they will swear that they couldn't get one and that they are the person they say that they are, and under penalty of perjury they sign that, then they can vote. So we changed that. We took it back. It was struck down again by the same fairly liberal judge, Obama judge, and we appealed to the Fifth Circuit. We just made those arguments last week, December 5th. I feel very confident we did exactly what the Fifth Circuit asked us to do. So, you know, we're going to see what happens with our 3-judge panel. If we lose, we'll appeal probably to the whole circuit. And if we can't get anything done there, we'll go to the U.S. Supreme Court. So I feel very good about that case. And finally, I'll talk about redistricting. And this is not the last case we're involved in. We've got many of these cases. But redistricting is really interesting. We passed redistricting, both House, Texas House, and congressional redistricting in 2011. It was struck down. We came back in 2013. A 3-judge panel redrew the lines. The legislature adopted the exact lines that the 3-judge panel drew. We were sued again. It was struck down recently. And so this 3-judge panel struck it down. They struck down their own maps. And they asked Governor Abbott, they gave him 3 days to call a special session to redraw the lines. And I suggested to Governor Abbott that we shouldn't do that. Let's go defend the map that the court drew. And so we appealed. We have a direct appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we did it. And we got a 5-4 stay, so our maps are back in place. And in this spring, we'll get to actually argue the maps. But if you can't accept a map that the court drew, drawing our own maps isn't going to change anything. And so I'm very happy to go defend the maps that these 3 judges drew, and I think ultimately we'll be successful in that. But I just want you to see the strategy and why this fight, why having a Republican president, why this last election mattered so much. Because the reality is, we're here in Texas, we're fighting the fight, we're winning the fight, but ultimately, had we had a different election result, instead of Neil Gorsuch, we get another Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and guess what? The immigration case, 4 judges said, yes, the President of the United States has the ability to change the law. I mean, that is a shocking result. I can't believe that any judge would say that, but they did. And so had we had another Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we would have been, in my opinion, post-constitutional. We would have been separation of powers gone, federalism gone, power in the hands of one, and apparently the left wants that because that's what they push for, that's what their judges vote for. It's shocking to me because obviously Trump could be doing the same thing, he's not. But that is a reality that I think as Texans, because we ultimately, it's our resources, it's our vote that keeps this country from flipping the other way. And that's why people like you and what you're doing at TPPF and supporting TPPF and continuing to be involved in this process, it's really just a few people who are really making the difference in Texas and helping to elect the right people so that we can go fight. But we must remain strong. We must be continued diligent in protecting the Constitution. If it doesn't come from Texas, if we're not diligent here, I can tell you, then the reality is we're going to lose the country and we are going to end up post-constitutional. And once we do, it'll be very difficult to come back. So I just want to say, one, thank you for supporting this organization because of the work they do on this issue, which I consider to be one of the most important issues of our lifetime. And by the way, we're working on something in my office to try to undo not only the Chevron, the court deference issue, but we're also trying to put Congress back in control of their own destiny, which is basically requiring that if there's something significant coming from an agency, Congress actually has to vote on it. And that's something that typically I wouldn't think an AG from any state would be working on, but the reality is I don't want to have these fights now and win, and then 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I'm gone and we end up in the same battle with a liberal president, liberal court. And so we have to change the structure of this administrative state and the executive branch to make sure that in the future, no matter who the president is, Republican or Democrat, we don't end up in the same situation where we have an executive branch running the country and ignoring the rest of our government, including our states. So thank you all for having me here. I hope you all have a great rest of the day, and God bless. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions, so I don't, yes, sir.
A cynical question. After you won the
Aren't they all?
after you won the decision, I forgot if it was DACA or DAPA, and the Obama administration said, okay, we'll follow the law, and then their people didn't follow the law. Were there ever any consequences for bureaucrats saying, screw the Constitution, screw the courts, screw the law?
So interestingly enough, when we were in litigation with the DOJ, they told us that they had not actually been implementing this while we were in litigation. In other words, we got to stay while we were in litigation. They weren't supposed to be admitting more people, but we found out during the litigation that they lied to us and they lied to the court. And the courts came back and said, what can I do to the federal government? If I sanction you, then don't the taxpayers just end up paying for it? And that was the answer. So he sent the Department of Justice lawyers to remedial training, some type of ethics training. I don't know if they ever did it, but for just arguing points against the Constitution, no, there was literally no consequence for those arguments being made.
Kind of the lowest learner rule?
Which one is that?
No, I'm thinking nothing ever happens when you
Exactly.
break the law.
Nothing happened, other than we got a new president who fortunately has not adopted that approach. He could have easily done it. And had he done it, we would have been sunk. Yeah. Yes.
In your litigation with federal government attorneys, do you expect them to follow the rules of professional conduct, the attorney's code, and do they generally, or do they take a win at any cost by any means approach, and do you have to respond accordingly?
So in the case that we just talked about, no, they did not follow. They lied. I mean, the judge knew they lied. We knew they lied. They just outright lied. That was the only one that we ever caught them. I will say this, it's been a whole lot different dealing with the Department of Justice since Trump came in. It's much more of a, you can call them and we can talk. We could never talk to the Obama administration. They really didn't take our calls, and so there was no negotiation, there was no talk, it was just we had to go sue them. This has been nice because we've avoided a lot of litigation by communicating, and I've really appreciated the openness of the Trump administration through the Department of Justice. Jeff Sessions has been great for us, and also the White House counsel and Trump's lawyers have also been very cooperative in working with us on all kinds of different issues. It's really refreshing. Yes.
Your reference to separation of powers and states earlier in your discussion, one aspect of that is the separation of powers is keeping government separated from industry. Eisenhower warned against industry and public-private partnerships where you have the large corporations who are colluding with government entities to subvert our Constitution. Do you have any activities or work going on in that area?
You know, we have an antitrust division, so we deal with some of that when we have corporations potentially becoming too large and monopolistic. But as far as being involved in litigation where there are public-private partnerships, we may be, but I'm not aware of any among our 30,000 cases, which I don't know the details of every case, obviously, and but I'm not aware of any that address that issue. Back there?
I have a question. Is this on? I don't know. Is it on? Okay. Question, Jerry Brown just recently signed legislation that on the sanctuary, which went the exact opposite of Texas, where you're going to make the whole state sanctuary state. And also, I know you mentioned about redistricting. Illinois, when they redistricted back in 2010, which was Democratic, they did a lot of gerrymandering. Has there been any lawsuits that you know of filed in either one of those states against, because I know you're talking about the left here in Texas. Where is the right in Illinois and where is the right in California? Because clearly a sanctuary state, I just can't believe that's not going to go being challenged. But I guess my question is, are there any legal challenges to those two types of legislation like you have here in Texas?
Not that I'm aware of. There's certainly a big case going to the U.S. Supreme Court from Wisconsin that the Republican legislature there accomplished, and that's going to be a big case that affects the rest of the country and, of course, our case. But I'm not aware of California, Illinois, or states like that being challenged on there.
Sued, they lost.
What's that?
The Republican Party of Illinois sued, they lost.
There it is. He said they lost in Illinois. Republicans sued and lost.
But as far as California goes, right?
I don't know of anything. Yeah. I'm trying to keep this guy getting some exercise.
What is the status of the holdover lawsuits that were all filed under Obama now that Trump has taken over? Has the not so new administration anymore taken a more favorable position on, basically have they settled out of court on any of them?
So many of them, yes. Some of them took a little longer, like DAPA took till about June. And they kept asking for more time. We gave more time, and then somewhere around June they said, we want more time, and we said, no, we're ready to go to court. And 2 days later they rescinded. So, they've had a lot to do, and so sometimes we've had to, kind of hold our ground on things like that, and ultimately when we've done that, we've gotten success. And they've done a lot on their own. We've worked with them a lot. I'm pretty optimistic about most of the cases that they're going to be resolved without, a long litigation trail. So I've been really pretty pleased with their efforts. Right here?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for fighting the good fight in what I consider to be a rigged game. Because I've considered the game that you've been playing with fighting in lawsuits in the federal court to be rigged because we're admitting that the federal government is our boss. I think the structure and the way the United States was set up is that the states and the people are the bosses and not the federal government. The Supremacy Clause says it's the Constitution that's supreme, not the federal government or the federal judiciary. And I think that you, as my representative here in Texas, and the people, as well as other elected officials, including our judges and our governor, are the final arbiter of constitutional meaning, because the 10th Amendment says that power is not delegated to the federal government, it's reserved to us. And I haven't seen anywhere in the Constitution that says that the Supreme Court is our master, is our ruler, and the final arbiter of constitutional meaning. So I would like you, as a constituent, talking to my representative, I would like you to start declaring what constitutional meaning is, and then working with the other officials of Texas to just stop the feds from doing it. Not going and begging permission from the guys who claim they're our masters, but to start acting like the sovereigns that we are. And I wanted to see what you thought about that.
So the legislature has given me lawyers, so I try to use them the best that I can. I'll give you an example of an issue like that. When the whole marriage decision came down, I was asked by the lieutenant governor. So where I do have the opportunity to give my opinion is when I get asked for it. Under the Constitution, I'm granted that authority and that job. And so he asked me, well, so what do these county clerks do who have a religious view that is in opposition to same-sex marriage? And so we issued our opinion and said, look, the Supreme Court has come up with a newly minted constitutional right that they made up under the 14th Amendment. But there's still this First Amendment right, and so you cannot force somebody to do something against their First Amendment rights. For that, I had bar complaints filed against me by 150 lawyers. I had to go through a year-long process where they tried to take my license. When I tried to defend the state on an issue because I didn't feel like the Supreme Court had answered every question about same-sex marriage and health benefits, so I advised my client, don't capitulate, let's go fight them in court. We can win this. The judge in San Antonio tried to hold me in contempt and put me in prison for representing my client and doing my constitutional duty. Ultimately, my client backed down, which I wouldn't have done. So we have had opportunities to really take it on, and for me, it's come at risk of being put in prison for doing my constitutional role. I would have found that really interesting if a federal judge puts the Texas Attorney General in prison for representing his client and giving good advice that is completely, this obviously is a new area of law that was just made up, and so it would have been really interesting to let, I actually wanted that to go forward just to see if that would actually, I'd end up in jail for doing my job.
It would be terrible if the men that protect you here would have to protect you from federal marshals. It would be terrible. That's what we may have to do.
General Paxton, thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Y'all have a great holiday. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank y'all. Good to see you. I gotta go to a party. My own deal.
What a wonderful presentation. Thank you for your questions. The following is not as important as listening to the Attorney General of Texas, but I know you may want some lunch. So if that's the case, you can head to the lobby where there are boxed lunches. I would ask you to come right back in because we have one more panel that will sort of tie a really nice bow on this. Thinking about some of the questions, we'll have some of the answers to those. See you in 15 minutes at 12:45.